My name is Eleanor Reid. I am 61 years old. For most of my life, I worked quietly behind the scenes, advising others on how to manage their finances, build their futures, and protect what mattered most. I was never the loudest voice in the room. I was the steady one, the one people forgot until they needed something solid to hold on to. I built my life alongside my husband, Charles Reid, a man I loved for 38 years. Together, we raised his son Lucas from his first marriage. Together, we built Reid Financial Group from nothing more than two desks in a rented office and a dream we refused to give up on. But dreams are fragile, and sometimes betrayal doesn't come from the outside. Sometimes it comes from the family you thought you could trust. I remember that day vividly. The day my daughter-in-law Veronica looked me dead in the eye and, with the faintest smirk, announced, "You're out of the 77 million." We were seated around a long polished table in a conference room I had helped design years ago. The air smelled faintly of expensive leather and fresh printer ink. Veronica sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her smile soft but unyielding, like a queen addressing her court. She said it casually, as if she were reading the weather. I wasn't even looking at her when she spoke. I was staring at the papers in front of me, still half expecting Charles to walk in to break this surreal silence with one of his clumsy jokes. But he was gone. And then I heard the words. Veronica's voice, calm, polished, declared that I was erased from the inheritance. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that tells you you've already lost, and the world has moved on without you. I didn't speak. I didn't move. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. Every eye in the room shifted, some with pity, others with polite discomfort. My stepson Lucas couldn't even meet my gaze. He looked down at the table, hands folded too tightly, jaw clenched too hard. I thought that would be the end of it, that they would sign the papers, lock the doors, and I would be left to vanish quietly into the margins of my own story. But then something happened. The lawyer Walter Grant, a man who had known Charles longer than I, had put the papers down. He adjusted his glasses, leaned back slightly in his chair, and, God help me, he laughed. Not a loud laugh, not a cruel laugh, but the kind of laugh that tells you something isn't right, that what's been presented isn't the full picture. The room froze. Veronica's smile twitched just for a second. And in that tiny crack, I felt it, the first breath of air after nearly suffocating. The unmistakable shift in the wind when a storm is about to break. In that moment, I understood something that changed everything. I wasn't just erased. I was rewritten. Silently. Carefully. And perhaps, just perhaps, Charles hadn't been as blind as they wanted me to believe. I didn't say a word. Not yet. But I promise you this, when someone tries to steal your story, you don't rage. You don't beg. You wait. You gather. And when the time comes, you tell the truth so clearly, so deliberately, that no one can look away. That was the moment my story began. Not with the betrayal, but with the decision to stand. I wasn't always the woman sitting in that cold conference room, watching my life reduced to legal documents and polite betrayals. There was a time when I was more than a name on a page. Charles and I met when we were both too young to know how the world would shape us. He was ambitious, reckless in his optimism. And I was the one who kept both feet on the ground. We didn't have money. We didn't have connections. We had a used car, shared dreams, and an idea for a small financial consultancy that nobody took seriously. I still remember the first office we rented: two battered desks, mismatched chairs, and a window that leaked every time it rained. But it was ours. Every client we gained, every dollar we earned, we built with our own hands. Charles called me his compass, said I kept him true when the world tried to pull him off course. For 38 years, we built a life not of luxury, but of shared purpose. Every decision, every late-night strategy session, every quiet moment over tea, it all mattered. But somewhere along the way, cracks began to form. Not between Charles and me. No, our bond was something else entirely. The cracks came from the outside, from family. Lucas was Charles's son from his first marriage. I came into his life when he was just 8. I raised him as my own, tucked him in at night, clapped at his school plays, soothed his teenage heartbreaks. But something between us always remained. Distant. Not cold, not overtly cruel. Just unreachable. Like no matter what I gave, I would always be on the outside of some invisible wall. And then there was Veronica. She entered our lives with sharp heels, sharper words, and eyes that never quite met mine. From the very first dinner, I felt it, the calculation behind every smile, every polite nod. There's a kind of person who studies you the way a hunter watches prey, not with hatred, but with precision. I tried. God knows I tried. I told myself I was imagining things that time would soften whatever distance existed between us. But as the years passed, I saw the small shifts. Veronica's growing influence over Lucas, the way conversations tilted subtly away from me, the quiet dismissals, the carefully staged moments where I became the outsider in my own home. And I let it happen. I let it happen because I believed love and loyalty would hold, because I thought Charles's heart would be the anchor that kept everything steady. But when I sat in that room, erased from the will, from the legacy we built, I realized too late, love means nothing to those who see the world as a game of acquisition. To people like Veronica, loyalty is a currency. And I had become obsolete. I kept my expressions still. But inside, I asked myself the question that had begun to echo louder than any other. When did I lose control of my own story? When did I become invisible in the very life I had helped create? And most of all, what had I done? What silent, unseen crime had I committed to be erased so thoroughly by the very family I thought I belonged to? That question haunted me, and I knew I couldn't let it remain unanswered. The funeral was flawless, every flower arranged in neat symmetrical rows, every program printed on thick ivory cardstock. The music soft piano played just loudly enough to fill the silence, but not so much that anyone would have to raise their voices. It was by all appearances perfect, and I hated every second of it. I stood there smiling where I was supposed to smile, nodding where I was supposed to nod, feeling like a stranger at my own husband's farewell. Veronica had handled everything. The venue, the guest list, the eulogy. Even the photographs chosen for the memorial display were her choices, not mine. I wasn't asked, not once. I watched her move through the room in that tailored black dress, her hands folded gently, her expression soft with just the right touch of grief. People whispered words of comfort to her as if she were the widow, as if Charles had been hers to lose. Lucas was no better. He stood by her side, silent and distant, barely making eye contact with me. I kept waiting for him to reach out to say something, anything that might pull me back into this moment, but he didn't. And so I drifted on the outside looking in. I heard fragments of conversation around me, business associates, sharing fond memories of Charles's early career, neighbors recalling his laughter at last year's barbecue. And yet no one approached me. No one asked how I was managing, how I was surviving the quiet collapse of everything I had built my life around. I told myself it was grief, that maybe people just didn't know what to say. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just awkwardness. This was erasure, carefully orchestrated and executed with surgical precision. At one point, I found myself alone, near the back of the reception hall, next to a small table holding guest books and floral arrangements. I looked around the room at the faces of people I'd known for decades and felt an unfamiliar chill crawl across my skin. That was the first moment the thought came to me, I don't belong here. Not anymore. Charles and I had built this community together. We had hosted these people in our home. We had poured our time, our money, our love into every thread of this fabric. And yet, standing there with my hands folded over my coat, I realized I had become invisible, erased not by one act, but by 1,000 small omissions. I looked toward Veronica. She was standing near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Lucas's arm, her voice soft as she offered her condolences to another guest. Her eyes flickered briefly in my direction, but she didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply looked through me like I was furniture in the background. It was surgical, clean, perfect. When the service ended, the cars began to pull away. People murmured their goodbyes with well-rehearsed solemnity. No one offered me a ride. No one asked if I was all right. I stood alone, the wind pulling at the hem of my coat, the scent of cut lilies sharp in the cold air. I could still hear the last notes of the piano fading into the evening, and for the first time I realized the life I thought I still had already been dismantled piece by hands I had once trusted. I was no longer part of this story. Not in their eyes. Not in theirs. I wasn't planning to speak with anyone after the funeral. The weight of everything, the hollow condolences, the carefully curated grief had left me numb. I wanted nothing more than to slip away unnoticed, to sit in the quiet and let the ache settle. But as I gathered my coat near the door, I felt a hand on my arm. Eleanor, a familiar voice said. I turned to see Walter Grant Charles's oldest friend, his attorney of over 25 years. There was something different in his eyes that day, a flicker of hesitation, a shadow I couldn't name. We stepped outside away from the murmurs and the soft piano music still echoing from inside. The wind bit at my skin, but Walter didn't seem to notice. He glanced down at the ground before meeting my gaze. There's something you should know, he said quietly, almost as if the trees might be listening. Charles had concerns, doubts even, about some of the changes being made in the last few months. My heart clenched. What kind of changes? Walter hesitated. I can't speak freely? Not yet, but I can tell you this, the will you heard today, it wasn't the first version. And it wasn't the one Charles and I discussed the last time we met. Something shifted quickly, and I don't believe he was in the right frame of mind when certain decisions were finalized. His words settled over me like ice. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I felt as if the ground beneath me had tilted slightly, just enough to throw everything I thought I knew into question. He squeezed my arm gently. Don't give up, Eleanor. I believe there's more to this. I nodded, but the weight in my chest only grew heavier. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and every creak of the old house sounded louder than it should have. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the words concerns and doubts looping through my mind. The next morning, I made a decision I hadn't planned on. I reached for an old contact, Margaret Ellis. Decades ago, she and I had worked together in the early days of Reid Financial Group. She had since built her own reputation as a sharp, unshakable litigation attorney. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called, her voice held the same warmth I remembered. We met for coffee in a quiet cafe tucked between two brick buildings downtown. She wore a simple gray coat and a silk scarf, her eyes just as sharp as ever. After brief pleasantries, I told her everything, the will, Veronica Walters' quiet warning. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tapped softly against her cup, a quiet rhythm of calculation. When I finished, she set the cup down and leaned in. Eleanor, she said, her voice low, deliberate. Financial manipulation happens more often than people think, especially in cases of cognitive decline. If Charles was being influenced subtly or otherwise, there are ways to uncover it. Paper trails, witnesses, even digital footprints. I exhaled slowly. But how do I fight them, Veronica? Lucas, they've already won. I'm out. Her eyes didn't waver. You're only out if you walk away. But if you're willing to stand your ground quietly, carefully, I'll help. Something in me shifted then. A spark I thought I'd lost. I looked at her across the table and found my voice again. Let's begin. I don't know what made me walk into Charles's study that morning. Habit, maybe. Muscle memory from years of quiet Sundays spent side by side at his desk, with a legal pad me by the window, with a book and a cup of tea. But that morning felt different. The air was heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I ran my fingers along the edge of his desk. Everything was still in place, untouched, since the last day he sat here. His fountain pen resting in its holder, a half-burned candle, the small brass clock that no longer ticked. Grief has a way of freezing time, of making you believe that if you stand still long enough, maybe the person you lost will walk back through the door. But he didn't. I sat down, hesitated for a moment, then opened the bottom drawer. Inside, I found what I expected: ledgers, old tax returns, carefully labeled files. Charles was nothing if not meticulous. Yet something caught my eye: a small leather-bound notebook tucked between folders. The kind he used to carry in his coat pocket, the kind he scribbled in during long flights or restless nights. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. At first, the pages were ordinary lists of investments, market trends, names, and dates that meant little without context. But about halfway through, I found a page that stopped me cold. In Charles's familiar handwriting, steady but a little less sure than I remembered, were the words, "Don't let them push you to sign when your mind isn't yours." I read it twice, then a third time, my breath catching in my throat. The ink was smudged in places, as though he had hesitated, or perhaps his hands had shaken. But the meaning was clear. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was a warning he never gave me. The memory came back in pieces the last few weeks of his life, the way he grew quieter, more withdrawn. Veronica's constant presence, hovering, guiding conversations, shielding him from calls. I had dismissed it as stress, as the inevitable wear of illness. But now, looking at those words on the page, I saw something else entirely. Charles had known. He had known something was wrong. He just hadn't found a way to say it out loud. I sat there for what felt like hours, the notebook resting on my lap. Outside the window, the wind pushed through the bare branches of the maple trees we had planted decades ago. The same trees Charles once joked would outlive us both. I traced my fingertips over his writing, feeling the slight indentations where his pen had pressed into the paper. It was the closest I could come to hearing his voice again. And somewhere deep in the hollowed-out ache of my chest, a new feeling took root. Not anger. Not yet. Resolve. I closed the notebook gently, as though it were something fragile, and placed it in my bag. I stood, adjusted the collar of my sweater, and looked around the study one last time. They thought I was finished. They thought I would accept the story they handed me. But they were wrong. And in that moment, I made myself a promise I would not be erased. I have always believed that the truth doesn't arrive in grand explosions. It doesn't kick down doors or shatter windows. The truth, real truth, leaks in slow deliberate through the cracks we're too busy to notice. That's how it happened for me. The day after I found Charles's notebook, Margaret called. Her voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the undercurrent. Something had shifted. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I had a forensic specialist examine the documents from the will reading. There are discrepancies." I didn't respond right away. I sat in the corner of the living room, the same corner where Charles and I had once decorated our first Christmas tree. And I listened as Margaret explained. The signature, she continued, "It's not consistent. The pressure points, the curvature of certain letters, especially the R in Reid, they don't match his verified samples from the last 2 years. It's subtle, but it's there." I closed my eyes. I could see Charles's hands so clearly in my mind, those long fingers, the way he always tapped the edge of his pen when deep in thought. His signature wasn't just handwriting. It was him. I had seen it 1,000 times on documents, on birthday cards, on sticky notes left on the fridge. I felt my breath steady, slow. "There's more," Margaret added. I pulled transaction records linked to Veronica's consulting firm. 2 weeks before Charles passed, there was a large wire transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. 5 million. I opened my eyes. 5 million. The number felt unreal, like it belonged in someone else's life, someone else's betrayal. Margaret's voice softened. I know this is overwhelming, but this isn't over. These details, they matter. We can use them. I didn't answer right away. My gaze drifted to the framed photograph above the mantel, Charles and I years ago standing on the deck of our first little house by the lake, his arm around my waist. The sun low behind us. We were younger then, but the trust in his eyes, it had never changed. I set the phone down gently and sat in the stillness. The realization didn't come in a rush. It came in fragments, like porcelain splintering beneath careful hands. 1, Charles didn't sign that will. 2, Veronica had moved money in secret, in preparation for something I was never meant to see. 3, the people I had once called family had rewritten the story while I was too busy grieving to notice. I inhaled deeply, the air sharp against the back of my throat. There are betrayals that scream, and there are betrayals that whisper. This was the latter. I stood, walked slowly to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, hands steady. It struck me then how calm I felt. Not detached, not numb, just still. Because sometimes the heart breaks so completely, so utterly, that there's no sound left, only quiet. And in that quiet, I realized something else. They weren't careful enough. Well, not this time. I carried my tea to the window, the notebook still resting on the side table, and I whispered to myself under my breath, I see you now. It wasn't rage, it wasn't fear, it was the beginning. Ask ChatGPT. By the time I met Margaret again in her office, something inside me had shifted. The woman who walked through those glass doors wasn't the same woman who had sat frozen at the will reading. I wasn't whole, not yet, but I was no longer weightless. Margaret didn't waste time. She spread the documents across the table, copies of the forensic analysis transaction records, the old notebook with Charles's words. And she looked at me the way only someone who has walked through their own fire can look at another, steady, unflinching. I'm filing a petition to freeze the estate, she said, her tone crisp, measured. If we move now, we can prevent any further transfer of assets until this is properly investigated. I nodded. The words made sense, but they felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold through a pane of glass. Veronica won't take this lightly, I murmured. She's not the type to back down. Margaret offered the faintest smile. That's why we don't give her the choice. The paperwork was dense pages of legal jargon, case precedents, official requests, but Margaret guided me through every line. I signed where I needed to sign. I asked the questions that mattered. But a part of me, the quiet part, was already elsewhere. It was thinking of Lucas. Later that evening, after the motion had been filed, I sat alone in the living room when my phone buzzed. A message. Just 2 words. From Lucas. Can we talk? I hesitated. I don't know why I agreed to meet him. Curiosity, perhaps. Or some stubborn piece of me still clinging to the boy I had once cradled when he scraped his knees. We met at a small park, neutral ground. The air was cool, the sky bruised with the last light of day. Lucas looked older, tired. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding my eyes at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. I didn't know she'd take it that far. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. He exhaled sharply, shook his head. I thought I was protecting Dad's legacy. Veronica said she said you were going to dismantle everything. I studied him, his hunched shoulders, his nervous fingers tugging at his sleeve. I could see the boy in him still, but also the man who had stood by and let this happen. Did you ever ask me? I asked softly. Did you ever once ask what I wanted, what your father and I built together? His eyes flickered. For a moment I thought I saw something break. Regret, maybe? Shame. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She said we had to act fast, he muttered, before things got complicated. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the web was so clear now. Veronica hadn't just manipulated Charles. She had manipulated Lucas too. Fear, urgency, loyalty. She had pulled every thread until he became something hollow, something easily steered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I only said quietly, "You still have choices, Lucas, but you won't find them standing behind her." He didn't reply. He only looked away toward the dark line of trees beyond the park. I left him there, not out of cruelty, but because some battles can't be fought for others. That night, as I locked the door behind me, I whispered the words I hadn't dared say before. This is my life, and I will not be erased. I found the recording by accident. It was late, too late for tea, too early to sleep. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the old mantel clock. I had gone into Charles's study not looking for anything in particular, maybe just searching for the comfort of his presence or the echo of it. Grief does that. It turns you into a ghost hunter in your own home. I opened the small wooden box where he kept random odds and ends, cufflinks, paper clips, forgotten keys to doors that no longer existed. Beneath it all was an old digital voice recorder, one of those simple black models we used to carry before smartphones made them obsolete. My hands hesitated. I don't know why I pressed play. Maybe I was hoping for the sound of his laughter, some fragment of a memory to hold on to. But what I heard instead broke something deep inside me. His voice, Charles's voice, soft, weary. "If you're hearing this," he began, "then I suppose I'm not here." He laughed, a quiet, breathless sound, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I know how this sounds. Maybe it's nothing, maybe I'm just tired. But something doesn't sit right, Elle. Veronica's been persistent. About the will, about the trust, about changing things. She keeps telling me it's standard, that I'm just being old-fashioned. There was a pause. I could hear him shift, the faint rustle of fabric, the scratch of pen on paper in the background. But I can't shake it. Every time I ask questions, she has an answer. Every time I delay, she smiles that smile. You know the one. I felt my heart fracture along familiar lines. She says Lucas agrees with her, that it's for the family's future. But it doesn't feel like family. It feels like I'm being nudged, moved. His voice faltered. I'm not as sharp as I used to be. I can feel it. The treatments, the exhaustion, it's like pieces of me are slipping through my fingers. But this I know you would never do, what she's suggesting. And if something happens, if the paperwork looks wrong, please, Elle, please look closer. Silence stretched. Then one final line, barely more than a whisper. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you. I'm sorry. I love you. The click of the recording ending felt like a door slamming shut. I sat there, the recorder still warm in my hand. My breath caught somewhere between a sob and a scream. The room spun. The weight of those words pressed against my chest, sharp and unrelenting. He knew. Charles had known. And he had been too weak, too afraid, too lost to stop it. And worse, he hadn't told me. Not in time. I pressed my palm against my mouth, tears blurring the edges of everything. It wasn't just the betrayal of Veronica or Lucas. It was the quiet betrayal of the man I loved more than anything, who had died carrying a secret he thought he was sparing me from. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes. Hours. The house around me unchanged, uncaring. Eventually, I wiped my face, set the recorder down, and whispered to the empty room, "I heard you." And from that moment, I knew I wouldn't just survive this. I would finish what he couldn't. It was close to midnight when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. The house had been still for hours. I had been sitting in the study, the recorder resting on the desk, Charles's voice still haunting every corner of my mind. When I opened the front door, I found Lucas standing there, shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes rimmed with something that looked dangerously close to regret. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. I just stepped aside. We sat across from each other in the living room, the only sound, the soft ticking of the old clock. I didn't offer tea. I didn't ask how he was. I waited. He kept his eyes on the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said it would be simple. The dad wanted it this way. That you were out of touch." I folded my hands in my lap. "And you believed her?" He flinched at the flatness of my tone. At first, I didn't know what to think. Veronica. She's convincing. She said you wanted to sell everything, walk away from the foundation, that you weren't in the right state to handle it. I stayed silent. The words didn't sting the way they once might have. I had already bled for this. I went along with it. He admitted, his voice cracking. I didn't ask questions. I thought. He shook his head. Honestly, I don't know what I thought. I studied him, this man I had once held as a child, the boy I had sung to sleep when nightmares chased him through the dark. His face was older now, lined, tired, but I could still see the outline of the child he used to be. And I felt nothing but weariness. I found a recording. I said softly, "Your father knew. He may not have said it directly, but he knew something wasn't right." Lucas closed his eyes. "I didn't know about that." I nodded. "No, I'm sure you didn't. But you knew enough. You knew who Veronica was. You knew what she was capable of." He buried his face in his hands, his voice muffled. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought his words broke. I don't know how to fix it. I took a slow breath, the weight of everything settling deeper into my bones. When I spoke, my voice was even but cold. "There are wounds, Lucas," I murmured, "that you don't mend with a simple apology." He looked up, then truly looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw him for who he was, not just a pawn, not just a victim, but a man who had made choices. Choices with consequences. I stood, signaling the end of the conversation. You can't undo what's been done, but you can choose who you become next. He didn't speak again. He only nodded quietly and let himself out into the night. I locked the door behind him, stood in the darkness of the hallway, and felt the shift within myself. It wasn't victory. It wasn't closure. It was something colder, something sharper. A line had been drawn, and I finally was ready to stand on the side I should have chosen long ago. After Lucas left the house, settled into stillness once more, I stood for a long time in the entryway, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe, listening to the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes, but the kind that presses in on you, the kind that reminds you just how much space one person can leave behind when they're gone. I made no move to turn on more lights. Instead, I walked through the familiar rooms by memory. The walls, the furniture, the small imperfections in the floorboards, they were mine. They held pieces of me, of Charles, of the life we had built that now felt more than ever like a fading photograph left out in the sun. I found myself back in the study without realizing I'd even moved. The photo of Charles sat on the corner of the desk, one of the older ones, his face soft with laughter, his eyes lit by something no illness had touched yet. I traced the edge of the frame with my fingertips, the weight of the moment sinking deep. I thought about Lucas, his face, his words, the apology he didn't quite know how to make. I had no anger left for him, only distance, only a kind of detached sorrow for what had been broken things that I knew now could never be repaired. Forgiveness was a choice, and some choices I realized are best left undone. I sat down slowly in the worn leather chair. The house creaked softly in the night air. The wind brushed the windows, making the glass shiver. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the photo, my voice barely more than breath when I spoke. "I'm still here," I whispered. The words weren't for Charles. Not exactly. They were for me. I thought back to the years we had built brick by brick, mistake by mistake, joy by joy. We had survived so much the early failures, the lean years, the near losses. We had held hands through storms that would have split other marriages wide open. And yet, somehow, here I was, left to finish the story alone. I reached for the small notebook again, the one with his handwriting, the quiet warning he had left behind. I ran my fingers across the page, feeling the faint ridges of the ink. There was still more to uncover, more to fight for. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of his voice wash over me. The real voice, not the shaky recording, not the fragments. The way he used to say my name. The way he used to laugh when something delighted him, even at the simplest things. I made him a promise then, not aloud, not in any grand gesture, just silently the way the heart speaks when no one else is listening. I would finish this, not for revenge, not for anger, but for the truth, for the life we had built, for the part of me that still believed in honor, even in a world that had made it feel obsolete. The wind outside shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a branch scraped against the side of the house, but I didn't move. I stayed there still, the photo in front of me, the past, curled around me like a second skin. And in that moment, utterly alone, I felt something steadier than rage, something colder than grief, resolve. I would see it through, to the end. The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope, the kind used for weddings or galas, not for grief. The script was elegant, embossed in silver, an invitation to a memorial event in Charles's honor, hosted by Veronica. Of course, I knew immediately what it was. Not a tribute, not remembrance, a performance. The evening of the event, I dressed carefully. Not to impress, not to compete. I wore simple black understated jewelry, the same scarf Charles had given me on our 25th anniversary. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to watch. The country club glittered beneath soft chandeliers. Every corner was polished, every table draped in white linen and soft candlelight. They had spared no expense. At the entrance stood a portrait of Charles, one I despised. It was a formal shot taken when the illness had already begun to hollow him. His eyes were tired, his smile strained. It wasn't the man I knew. I kept my distance, standing at the edge of the room as people I barely recognized drifted past. Glasses clinked. Laughter rippled through the air. Polite conversation hummed over the low swell of classical music. I watched it all unfold silent. Veronica moved through the crowd like a seasoned hostess. She smiled, she nodded, she touched arms lightly as she spoke. She was perfect, controlled, elegant, utterly false. People gathered around her, offering condolences she accepted with the grace of a woman who had not lost her husband, but had merely acquired a new title. Lucas stood beside her, his face drawn but compliant. His eyes met mine only once, and even then he looked away before anything passed between us. The speeches began. A former colleague spoke first, kind words, measured anecdotes. Then Veronica stepped forward. Her voice was soft trembling in just the right places. She spoke of Charles's vision, his legacy, his unwavering commitment to family and community. I stood very still. I heard her say his name. I heard the carefully chosen words, the curated memories. And I thought, this is how stories die, not in violence, not in sudden loss, but in quiet replacement. Applause followed, smiles, toasts raised. I watched hands lift glasses in the air, watched heads nod in solemn agreement. And I thought, I see you, all of you. I stood there invisible. I saw the people I had welcomed into my home, the ones whose children I had watched grow, the faces that had once lit up when they saw me. And now nothing. Polite glances, brief nods, and then eyes drifting past as though I were nothing more than another faded decoration. I see you. And you don't see me. The thought repeated itself slow and deliberate. I see you. I see the lies, the erasure, the rewriting of a man's life by people who never knew his heart. And I stood there holding every sharp edge of that truth in my hands. And I smiled. Not because I found any of it amusing, but because I knew something none of them did. This wasn't the end. It was only the curtain rising, and I would not be the one left standing in the shadows. Not this time. I waited until the room had softened. The first round of speeches was over, the wine flowing freely. People had settled into small clusters, their voices dropping to that comfortable murmur of shared memories and polite gossip. That's when I saw him, David Langley. David had been one of Charles's earliest business partners, a man who had sat at our kitchen table when we still used paper napkins and dreams as currency. He was older now, slower, his hair completely white, but his eyes held the same quiet sharpness I remembered. I crossed the room carefully, a small envelope tucked inside my bag. "David?" I greeted, my voice even polite. He blinked, startled for half a second before his expression softened. "Eleanor," he said, offering a small, genuine smile. "It's good to see you. I wasn't sure you'd be here." I returned the smile. Neither was I. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us watching Veronica across the room as she laughed softly with another circle of guests. David cleared his throat. "I miss him," he murmured. "Charles? He was different, one of the good ones." I nodded. Yes, he was. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing over the edges of the small envelope before pulling it free. I held it out to him without ceremony. "What's this?" he asked, frowning slightly. "Something you should see," I said quietly. "Not here, not now, but when you have a moment." His brows drew together. I could see the hesitation, decades of boardroom instincts reminding him to be cautious. But then he saw my eyes, and I think something shifted in his. Without another word, he took the envelope and slipped it into his coat pocket. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. I simply smiled, soft and small. Across the room, Veronica caught sight of me. Her eyes flickered, not panic, not yet, but the first seed of unease. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but the edges of her smile faltered. David's wife came to join us then, her hand brushing his sleeve. He excused himself, gently offering me one last look, one that held both curiosity and something more, doubt. I turned away before anyone else could engage me, moving back toward the far wall where the shadows gathered. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, just paper passed from one hand to another, just eyes meeting for a brief heartbeat too long. That was all I needed. I stood near the window for the rest of the evening, watching the reflections of strangers and former friends shimmer across the glass. I could hear laughter still, the clink of glasses, the carefully controlled rhythm of public mourning. But something had shifted. I felt it in the way the smiles were just a second too slow to form, in the way glances began to drift toward me, cautious, curious. The story Veronica had so carefully crafted was starting to fray at the edges, and I didn't have to say a word. I held my hands together, calm and still, and thought to myself, this is how you begin to take back a life, not with noise, but with presence, with quiet, with patience, and with the truth waiting just beneath the surface. The next discovery came quietly, the way most truths seem to. Margaret called just after sunrise. Her voice was sharper than usual, her words clipped but careful. I could hear the weight of whatever she was about to say before she even spoke it. The forensic team confirmed it. She began without preamble. "The signature on the revised will, it's not Charles's." I closed my eyes. They were meticulous. She continued, her voice softening, but the pressure analysis doesn't match. The slant, the baseline, even the natural tremor in his hand. It's absent. "Eleanor, it's forgery." I said nothing for a moment. The information settled over me like a slow, deliberate tide. It wasn't surprise, not anymore. It was something colder, something quieter. "There's more," Margaret added. Of course there was. A former employee at Veronica's firm forwarded us an internal email. It's brief but explicit. She read it aloud. Subject: final adjustments. Message: confirm removal of ER from all remaining benefits and discretionary clauses as discussed. Proceed per original plan. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tracing the rim of the teacup resting on my lap. The same cup Charles had bought me years ago on an ordinary afternoon. I remember him handing it to me with a grin, no special occasion, just because he thought the color suited me. I held on to that memory as Margaret's words sank deeper. "Hui bo moi quien loi qua theo junke hoich." Not a mistake, not an oversight, a plan. I let a thin smile touch the corner of my mouth. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It wasn't anger. It was something more skeletal than that, something that belonged to the marrow. I murmured half to myself, "I suppose in their eyes I died a long time ago." Margaret was quiet on the other end of the line. "They didn't just rewrite the will," I continued softly. "They rewrote me, erased me from the narrative like I was never there to begin with." I heard the quiet sympathy in Margaret's breath, but she knew better than to offer comfort I wouldn't take. I stood. Then the phone pressed to my ear, the morning light just beginning to filter through the curtains. The house felt different, less like a home, and more like a witness. Every corner of it held pieces of the life I had lived, the life now under quiet siege. "What's our next step?" I asked, my voice steady. "We file," she said simply. "We present both the forensic report and the email. We request an immediate freeze and prepare for a formal challenge." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Do it." After the call ended, I stood in the stillness of the room for a long while, the air cool against my skin. I let the weight of everything rest on my shoulders, every small betrayal, every calculated smile, every quiet exclusion that had led to this moment. And then, without ceremony, I allowed myself to laugh just once, a breath of irony in the face of cruelty. I whispered softly, "They buried me before I ever left, but I was still here, and the reckoning had only just begun." The day of the board meeting arrived beneath a sky the color of steel, flat, cold, unforgiving. The air was sharp. As I stepped out of the cab, the tall glass building rising above me, like a monument to every decision I thought we had made together, but that I knew now had been an illusion. I took the elevator in silence. No music, no chatter, just the soft hum of machinery and the steady rhythm of my breathing. When the door slid open, the receptionist glanced up, her expression politely neutral. She gestured toward the conference room without a word. I walked the hallway slowly, deliberately. I wanted to feel every step. Inside the room, the board members were already seated. A dozen faces I recognized. Men and women I had toasted with, laughed with, trusted. At the head of the table sat Veronica, perfect as always. Her navy suit was tailored within an inch of its life, her dark hair twisted into a knot, without a single strand out of place. Her eyes flickered when she saw me, just for a second. And then the smile returned. I took my seat without invitation. No one stopped me. No one welcomed me either. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, updates on the Foundation's financials, upcoming charitable events, routine matters. Veronica's voice was smooth, rehearsed, every syllable dripping with polished sincerity. I said nothing. I let them move through the agenda until they reached the item that mattered, the formal transfer of executive authority. Veronica cleared her throat softly. "As you all know, Charles had always envisioned continuity for this organization, ensuring that it remained in capable hands after his passing. It is with great respect and humility that I raised one hand. A small movement, but enough." The room paused. All eyes turned toward me, some with confusion, others with barely veiled discomfort. Veronica's expression didn't shift, but I saw the tension in her jaw. "I won't take much of your time," I said quietly, my voice steady, slow. "But I believe there are relevant details, that this board has not yet been made aware of." No one spoke. I could hear the faint hum of the air vents, the distant sounds of the city somewhere beyond the glass. I reached into my bag, pulled out a simple folder, cream-colored, unassuming. I set it on the table and slid it toward David Langley, the same man I had spoken with at the memorial. His hands hesitated before he opened it. Inside the forensic analysis of the forged signature, the internal email from Veronica's assistant, a brief statement from the handwriting expert, clean, precise, undeniable. David's eyes moved slowly over the pages. The color drained from his face. The folder began to move past silently from one hand to another. As each person read, I could see it, the unraveling, the frowns, the flickers of recognition, the careful facade beginning to slip. Veronica's voice cut through the tension. "I don't think this is the appropriate, let them read," I said softly but firmly. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. I folded my hands in my lap, the fabric of my coat smooth beneath my fingers. I let my breathing stay slow, measured. This wasn't anger. It wasn't spectacle. It was truth, quiet, deliberate, and sharp as glass. When the last board member set the folder down, the room held its breath. No one spoke. Not immediately. And then David, bless him, lifted his eyes to mine. His voice was soft, almost reverent. Did he know?" I nodded once. He suspected. He didn't live long enough to stop it, but he left enough behind for me to finish what he couldn't. The room shifted, the energy cracked. Even those who had once aligned themselves with Veronica now looked uncertain, restless. Veronica's composure faltered, just slightly. Her fingers curled tight against the edge of her notes. I rose slowly from my chair. My voice remained calm. "I won't waste your time with arguments. You each have the documents. The truth is in front of you. What you do next is your decision." I gathered my bag, offered a final small nod, and walked to the door. Not rushed, not defeated. And as I stepped into the corridor, I heard it, the first whispered voices, the quiet unraveling that would spread long after I was gone. The first fracture, the beginning of the end. And I finally had taken the first step back into my own story. The quiet, after I sat back down, was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the silence of politeness, nor the awkward pause of social discomfort. It was heavier, denser. The kind of stillness that comes only when something irreversible has begun. Veronica sat motionless at the head of the table, her hands perfectly still atop her notes. Her eyes, however, betrayed her. Just a flicker, a blink, too slow, a breath held a fraction too long. But I saw it. Everyone saw it. The smirk she wore when this began, the same smirk she wore when she announced I was out of the will, was gone. David Langley cleared his throat softly. Perhaps we need clarification." Walter Grant, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. His eyes met mine briefly, then shifted to the stack of documents now resting at the center of the table. "Let's not pretend we're confused," he said gently, his voice carrying the calm weight of years in courtrooms. "We're all capable of reading." He adjusted his glasses, a ghost of a smile, brushing the corners of his mouth. "And I can assure you," he added with soft amusement, "the law has very little patience for shortcuts, or for those who move too quickly and too arrogantly through its process." His eyes flicked to Veronica. A ripple moved through the room, small but palpable. I let the moment hang before I reached once more into my bag. I placed a small black recorder on the table, setting it down carefully. I could feel my heartbeat slow but steady. "I'd like you all to hear something," I said quietly. Margaret had helped me isolate the audio. Clean, crisp. Charles's voice filled the room, soft but unmistakable. If you're hearing this, the recording played, then I suppose I'm not here. There was movement subtle across the table. One of the women drew in a sharp breath. Another man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I can't shake it, Charles's voice continued. Something doesn't sit right. Don't let them push you to sign when your mind isn't yours. I didn't watch Veronica. I didn't need to. I could feel her unraveling from where I sat. The recording ended. Silence returned heavier now. Walter spoke again, his voice soft, almost kind. In over 30 years, I never once saw Charles Reid make a rushed decision about anything, especially not his estate. He turned to the others. And yet here we are, presented with forensic evidence of forgery financial discrepancies, an internal email confirming malicious intent, and now his own words. No one moved. Veronica's lips parted, but no sound came. Lucas, who until then had sat stiff and pale, lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders began to shake, quiet sobs breaking through the stillness. It wasn't performative. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, the sound of a man realizing too late what he had allowed. I felt nothing as I watched him. Not pity, not triumph, only the steady clarity of truth finding its place. Veronica, however, held on longer. Her composure didn't snap, not yet, but the veneer cracked, the slight tremble in her hand, the way her eyes darted seeking refuge where none remained. Walter's smile deepened, slightly calm quiet. The law, he murmured, almost conversational, isn't for the impatient. Or for the reckless. He turned to the board. I suggest a formal postponement of any transfer until this matter is fully investigated. No one disagreed, not a single word of protest. I sat still, my hands resting softly on the polished wood of the table. I could feel their eyes, some filled with discomfort, some with something like respect. But I stayed rooted, calm, unshaken. Across from me, Veronica exhaled sharply, her smirk gone, her certainty crumbling, and I finally let myself breathe. It wasn't over, not yet, but the first real crack had split wide open, and I would see it through. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, the story had spread beyond anything I could have imagined. It started with a single headline in a local business journal, allegations of fraud in Reid Foundation's leadership transfer. By the end of the week, it was everywhere, national outlets, online forums, social media feeds lit up in every corner of my life. I watched from the quiet of my living room, the television murmuring in the background, the scrolling news ticker repeating my name in the same breath as words like inheritance scandal and power struggle. People I had never met were dissecting my life, my marriage, my grief, as if it were sport. Some called me a victim, brave, dignified, wronged. Others painted me as the villain, an aging woman clinging to control, resentful of a younger generation stepping in. The sharpest voices defended Veronica. I read the words with strange detachment. She built that fortune too. Modern families are complicated. Maybe she saved the foundation from ruin. I didn't reply. I didn't correct. I didn't defend. Instead, I sat in the stillness and let the storm rage without me. The noise was deafening, yet in my house it was quiet. I brewed tea. I watered the plants. I walked through rooms that still carried the scent of Charles's aftershave, the ghost of his laughter. And beneath the chaos, I could feel something deeper, the discomfort of truth resurfacing in a world that prefers polished lies. I knew what people couldn't see. This was never about money. It was about the quiet theft of a life, the rewriting of a story that was never theirs to tell. For every voice that called me bitter, there were others who saw. Strangers who wrote me letters. Women who whispered that they too had been erased, overwritten, sidelined. The world argued. I listened. And I kept moving forward. The last time I saw Lucas was in the garden behind the community center, Charles's favorite spot. It was spring by then. The daffodils were starting to bloom delicate and stubborn all at once. He arrived without calling ahead. I heard his footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find him standing there, hands deep in his pockets, the weight of too many regrets written across his face. We stood in silence for a long while. The wind stirred the petals at our feet. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, barely more than a breath. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for believing her, for not seeing it." I said nothing at first. I let the words settle between us like falling leaves. He swallowed hard. "I was weak," he murmured. "I let her tell me who you were. I let her tell me who I was. And I knew better. I knew." I looked at him, truly looked at him, the man, the boy, the cracks in between. "There are things we can't undo," Lucas, I said softly. "Some bridges don't burn, they rot, quietly, from the inside." His eyes filled, but he didn't wipe them away. He nodded, broken in all the ways I could no longer fix. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he whispered. I drew a slow breath, the air cool against my skin. "I do forgive you," I said quietly. "But I won't forget." He closed his eyes, then the weight of the words settling deep. When he opened them again, I could see the shift, the understanding that forgiveness isn't absolution. It's not erasure. It's a door that stays locked even when you hand someone the key. We didn't speak after that. I turned slowly and began to walk away. Not in anger, not in triumph, just forward. The wind caught at the edges of my coat as I left him standing there still as stone beneath the blooming trees. And in that moment, I understood forgiveness is not for the person who asks for it. It's for the one who chooses to live beyond the asking. And I was finally ready to live. The old door creaked when I pushed it open, soft, familiar, the sound of wood shifting on worn hinges. It was the same sound it had always made, the sound of coming home. I hadn't stepped inside the community center's back office in nearly a decade. Dust floated in the light spilling through the narrow window. The air smelled faintly of old paper and lavender cleaning oil. I set my bag down gently on the corner of the desk and exhaled. It was time. I had spent the last month untangling legal threads, meeting with the board, listening to lawyers speak in measured tones about restitution and closure. But none of it felt real to me until I sat here in this room with a blank page in front of me. Legacy. Such a fragile word. So easily rewritten, so easily stolen. I smoothed the edge of the paper and began drafting the new structure for the scholarships, the programs Charles and I had once dreamed of on quiet Sunday mornings, back when we still believed in the simplicity of giving. This time the scholarships would bear two names. Charles's, of course. His vision, his kindness, his tireless belief in second chances. But beside his, I wrote another name in careful script, Lucas Reid. Not as a reward, not as an absolution, but as a reminder that redemption doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from choosing differently when the next crossroads appears. I signed my name at the bottom and sat back, the breath in my chest, loosening, softening. Some doors, I thought, are meant to close. Others, no matter how much they creak, must be opened again. I gathered the papers, slid them into the folder, and stepped back out into the soft afternoon light. The wind caught the hem of my coat as I walked, the sound of the old door behind me, singing softly as it closed. Not the sound of an ending, but of return. The house is quiet again. I sit by the window now, the late afternoon sun, casting long golden stripes across the wooden floor. The air smells of mint tea, faint, comforting. My hands cradle the porcelain cup, its warmth seeping into my palms. There's a stillness to this moment that I hadn't felt in years. The noise has faded. The headlines moved on. The legal battles settled into silent paperwork. Veronica vanished into the distance, her name spoken less and less as time passed. Even Lucas, well, forgiveness is not a door you walk through together. Sometimes you leave it open. Sometimes you close it gently behind you. I don't think of her much anymore. What I think of Is this the way the light moves through this room at this time of day? The way Charles used to hum when he thought no one was listening? The sound of old floorboards sighing beneath careful footsteps? Small things, the things that stay. I'm not the same woman who sat frozen at the will reading. I'm not the same woman who let others speak her story for her. I've learned that survival isn't about battles or victories. It's about choosing again and again to return to yourself, no matter how far you've wandered. I've made peace with the fact that not every question has an answer, that some endings don't come with the satisfaction of justice served on silver platters, but some do come with truth. And truth, I've found, is enough. I sip the tea slowly, the taste fresh and quiet on my tongue, and I let myself smile. Not because everything is perfect, not because everything is whole, but because I am. And I understand now I was never rewriting the past. I was only choosing how to remember it. And I choose to remember it by the truth. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with soft sunlight and a warm cup of coffee resting beside you? Or is it the stillness of midnight, when stories like this keep you company long after the world has gone to sleep? Let me know in the comments. We read every word. We carry every story with us. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you pause, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of something gentler, something kinder. A community that still believes in healing and truth, and in the quiet power of second chances. Thank you for spending your time here with me. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And I hope you remember this: sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. Sometimes it waits patiently, softly, until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.